There are people in this world who pass through your life so quietly you never think to look twice at them. They sit in the back seat, they stare out the window, they say almost nothing, and then they're gone, and you realize too late that you were supposed to pay attention. My name is Edward Calloway. I'm 58 years old. I've been driving a cab in this small town for over 20 years, and I thought I'd seen every kind of person there was to see. I thought I knew loneliness. I thought I knew silence. I thought I understood what it meant to be completely, utterly alone in the world. I was wrong. It took a dead man to teach me that, and it took a courtroom full of strangers, a box of old documents, and one small, battered silver watch, the kind you can't even find parts for anymore, to make me understand what family really means. If you've ever felt like you were living on the outside of a life that was supposed to be yours, this story is for you. It started on a Friday. Like all the important things in my life, it started on a Friday.
I used to think I was good at reading people. 20 years behind the wheel will do that to you. You learn fast. The nervous ones who grip their phones too tight. The sad ones who look out the window like they're watching a movie of their own lives. The ones who talk too much because they're lonely, and the ones who go quiet for the same reason. I thought I had everyone figured out. Then there was Mr. Klein. He first got into my cab on a Friday evening in early October, about 4 years ago. I remember because the leaves were just starting to turn, and the whole town smelled like wood smoke and cold air. He was standing outside a narrow little building on Carver Street, an old clock shop with a hand-painted sign in the window that read, "Klein's Timepieces, repairs since 1971. He was maybe 80, maybe older, small and slightly stooped, wearing a brown cardigan that looked like it had been washed so many times it had forgotten its original color. He moved carefully, like a man who had learned to respect his own fragility. He got in without a word, gave me an address 6 blocks away, and sat with his hands folded in his lap. When we arrived, he handed me exact change, the correct fare down to the penny, plus one single dollar bill, placed on top like a period at the end of a sentence. "Same time next week," he said. Not a question, and that was it. I remember watching him shuffle toward the door of what turned out to be a diner on Maple Avenue, and thinking, cheapest tipper in the county, $1. After 6 blocks. But he was right about one thing. The next Friday he called again, and the Friday after that. For nearly 4 years, Mr. Klein was my most reliable fare. Same time, same route, same exact change, same $1 tip. I used to joke about it to my dispatcher, Rosa. I'd say, "Got my weekly dollar from the old clock man." She'd laugh and say, "Big spender." He never talked about himself. He never complained about the weather or the traffic or anything at all. Occasionally, he'd comment on something outside the window, a new building going up, a tree that had been cut down, but only as an observation, never an opinion. The only personal thing he ever asked me was always the same question. At the end of every single ride, just before he opened the door and stepped out, he would pause and look at me in the rear view and say, "How's your family, Edward? Anyone keeping an eye on you?" The first time he asked, I was surprised he even remembered my name. The second time, I figured it was just something old people say. By the 10th time, it had become part of the ritual, like the exact change and the $1 bill. But I never answered honestly, not once, because the honest answer was this. I didn't have a family, not really. My mother, Loretta, had raised me alone. She never talked about my father. When I was young, I asked. When I got older, I stopped asking because the silence was its own kind of answer. She'd passed 8 years ago, leaving behind a small apartment, a sewing box, and no explanations. I had a half-sister somewhere in Phoenix I hadn't spoken to in 15 years. That was the sum total of my family on this earth. So, every Friday when Mr. Klein asked his question, I would say something like, "Oh, fine, fine," or "Can't complain," and he would nod just once and get out of the cab. I used to wonder, in an idle sort of way, why he always asked. I should have wondered harder. If you've ever had a question sitting right in front of you that you were too tired to ask, this story is for you. It was the second Friday in March when he didn't call. I noticed it the way you notice when a clock stops. Not with alarm at first, just a vague sense that something is off, that the air in the room is slightly different than it was a moment ago. By 7 o'clock, I told myself he'd probably just forgotten. By 8, I told myself he wasn't feeling well. By 9, I drove past his shop on my own way home, almost without meaning to. The lights were off. A hand-lettered sign had been taped inside the glass door, closed temporarily. I drove home. I told myself it was none of my business. 3 days later, I got a phone call from a man named Gerald Hooper, who identified himself as an attorney. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "I'm calling on behalf of the estate of Wilhelm Klein. Mr. Klein passed away last Thursday evening, peacefully, at home. He left instructions that you be contacted directly." I had to pull over. I was driving when he called, and I had to actually pull my cab to the side of the road because my hands had gone strange and cold. "He left something for me?" I said. "Yes, sir. We'd like you to come to the office at your earliest convenience." I sat there on the shoulder of Route 9 for a long time after I hung up. Cars passed me. The sun was going down and turning the sky the color of an old bruise. I kept thinking about that $1 bill, about the way he always said same time next week like it was already decided, about the question he asked every single Friday. "How's your family, Edward?" I went to the attorney's office the following morning. Gerald Hooper was a careful man, the kind who chose every word like he was placing china on a shelf. He slid a manila envelope across the desk and told me that Mr. Klein had requested I go to the shop before I opened it. "He wanted you to see it first," Hooper said. He was very specific about that. I drove to Carver Street. The shop was unlocked. The attorney had given me a key, though I didn't need it. The door swung open easily, like it had been waiting for me. I don't know what I expected. Dust, maybe? The smell of an old man's closed-up life? What I found was something else entirely. The shop was small and absolutely still. Glass cases lined the walls, full of watches and clocks in every shape, some of them clearly antique, some modern, many of them in pieces, mid-repair. The smell was oil and metal and something faintly sweet I couldn't identify. And on the work table in the center of the room, set apart from everything else, were 3 things. A silver pocket watch, very old, on a worn leather cord, a small brass key, and a leather-bound notebook. I sat down on the stool behind the work table, his stool, and I opened the notebook. The first line stopped my breath. "If you are reading this, Edward, then I was a coward for longer than I should have been, and I am sorry." I read it twice. Then I turned the page. "Your mother's name was Loretta Ann Pressman. She was 22 years old when she fell in love with my son, Daniel. Daniel was 24. They were happy together. I could see that, even then, even when I refused to admit it. She was kind and bright and utterly devoted to him. But my wife, God rest her, would not accept her. We had money then and pride, which is a poison that wears the mask of virtue. We told Daniel that Loretta was not suitable, that she came from nothing, that she would hold him back. We were wrong. In every possible way, we were wrong. Daniel listened to us. He left her. He never knew she was carrying his child. He never knew about you." I had to stop reading. I set the notebook down on the work table and I pressed my hands flat against the wood and I breathed, just breathed. Outside on Carver Street, a truck rumbled past. Someone's dog barked twice and went quiet. My grandfather, Wilhelm Klein, the cheapest tipper in the county, the man who asked about my family every single Friday for 4 years, was my grandfather. And my mother had known. She had known and she had never said a word.
I didn't leave that shop for 3 hours. I read every page of that notebook, twice. Wilhelm Klein had been looking for me for 16 years. He'd hired a private investigator in his 70s after his wife passed and the guilt became too heavy to carry alone. The investigator had found my mother first, but Loretta had refused all contact. She'd sent back every letter unopened. She'd changed her phone number twice. When she died, the investigator found me. And Klein had made a decision that I still don't fully understand, and maybe never will. Instead of approaching me directly, instead of knocking on my door or calling me on the phone, he had simply gotten into my cab every Friday for 4 years. He had sat in my back seat and watched me drive and asked me how my family was, and he had kept his secret while he tried to figure out if I was someone worth knowing, if I was someone worth the disruption. I think now that he was also trying to work up the courage. I think he was an old man who had done a great wrong and didn't know how to say so, and so he kept buying himself one more week, one more Friday, one more chance to do it right. He never did. But the notebook told me things I never could have imagined. He had known where I went to school. He had contributed anonymously to a scholarship fund that had covered 2 years of my community college tuition, something I'd always attributed to a general grant. He'd had someone watch from my name in the local paper, and when I'd been in a car accident 12 years ago and spent 2 weeks in the county hospital, he had, somehow, covered the portion of my bill that insurance hadn't touched, through a third party, untraceable. He had watched over me from a distance for years, like a lighthouse that never turned on. And in the back of the notebook, in handwriting that had grown shakier toward the end, he had written, "I know I have no right to ask your forgiveness. I know I have no right to call myself your family. But I want you to know that I see you, Edward. I have always seen you. And if there is one thing a life of repairing broken things has taught me, it is this: nothing is too far gone to be worth trying." I closed the notebook, and I felt 2 things at once, 2 feelings so opposite they should have canceled each other out, but instead they sat side by side inside my chest like 2 old men on a park bench. The first was grief, deep, sudden, surprising grief, for the grandfather I never had, for the years we'd lost, for every Friday when I'd said, "Oh, fine, fine," and he'd nodded once and gotten out of the cab. The second was anger, because my mother had known. She had raised me to believe I had no father's side, no history, no roots. She had taken that from me, not because she was cruel, I don't think, but because she was hurt, because a family had once told her she wasn't good enough, and she had decided that the cleanest revenge was erasure. I understood it, and I was furious about it. And then there was the brass key. I used it to open a lockbox under the work table. Inside were additional documents, financial records, a copy of his will, and a DNA test he had already completed. His sample was on file with the lab. He'd left instructions for a matching test to be offered to me. He had thought of everything except the part where he was still alive to see how it turned out. But that was just the beginning of my plan, because what the notebook did not prepare me for, what Gerald Hooper told me gently but clearly 2 days later, was that Wilhelm Klein's other children had already heard about the will, and they were not going to make this easy.
There were 3 of them. Daniel, my biological father, had died 11 years ago of a heart attack, which was a grief I had to absorb alone in a parking lot before I could continue with anything else. But he had 2 siblings, a son named Richard, who was in his 60s, and a daughter named Patricia, who was in her late 50s. They had hired their own attorney by the time I sat across from them in Gerald Hooper's conference room. Richard was a large man with the kind of confidence that comes from never having had to doubt himself. He looked at me across the table with an expression I recognized immediately. I'd seen it on the faces of certain passengers over the years. The look that sizes you up and finds you wanting before you've said a single word. "I don't know what my father told you," he said, "but this is a family matter, and with respect, Mr. Calloway, you are not family." Patricia said nothing. She just watched me with careful eyes. Their attorney used words like unverified claim and financial exploitation of an elderly man and undue influence. At one point, he actually used the phrase common opportunist, and I had to put both hands flat on the table and remind myself to breathe. I had come into that room with the notebook, the lockbox documents, and the name of the DNA lab. I looked at Richard Klein and I said, "I'm not here for the money." He laughed, just a small sound, dismissive, almost bored. "Then what are you here for?" I thought about that for a moment, about the cab and the Friday evenings and the $1 bill, about my mother's closed face every time I asked about my father, about an old man sitting alone in a clock shop, keeping a notebook about a grandson he was too afraid to claim out loud. "I'm here," I said, "to prove that he saw me. That's all." The legal process took 4 months. They were not easy months. Richard's attorney made public statements that were picked up by the local paper. I had passengers recognize me and ask about it, and I had to decide every time whether to say something or just drive. Rosa, my dispatcher, told me she had my back no matter what. My half-sister in Phoenix called, the first time in 15 years, and said she didn't know what to think, but she was listening. I did the DNA test. The results came back, and they were exactly what that notebook said they would be. I submitted every document from the lockbox, the scholarship records, the hospital payment, the investigators' reports. I submitted Klein's own notebook, every page, as evidence of intent and relationship. And I testified. I stood up in front of a judge and I told the truth. I said I hadn't known. I said I'd thought he was just a fare, just a quiet old man with exact change and a $1 tip. I said I'd wished 100 times since reading that notebook that I'd asked him the question he always asked me. I came to this court, I said, not for the money and not for revenge. I came because one man who had every reason to stay silent chose to leave a record. He chose to say, "This person exists and he matters to me," and I watched over him the best way I knew how. I am here to honor that choice. I am here to make sure it counted. The courtroom was very quiet when I finished. Patricia Klein, I noticed, was not looking at her brother. She was looking at her hands. If you've ever had to stand up in a room full of people who wanted you to disappear, this story is for you. The judge ruled in my favor. My identity as Wilhelm Klein's grandson was legally recognized. The portion of the estate designated for me in the will, a modest amount, along with the shop and its contents, was upheld. Richard did not shake my hand. He walked out without looking at me. Patricia paused at the door. She turned back and looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, very quietly, "He talked about you, you know. He never said your name, but he talked about you." She left before I could answer. I stood in that courthouse hallway, alone, with the sound of her words still moving through me like a clock ticking in an empty room.
A lot of people assumed I would sell it. Even Rosa assumed it. She said, "What are you going to do with a clock shop, Eddie? You don't know anything about clocks." She wasn't wrong. I knew nothing about clocks. But I had 4 years of memories of a man who did. And I had a notebook, and I had a set of tools laid out on a work table that told me, without words, exactly how he had spent his time. I didn't sell it. I closed the cab account for a month. Rosa covered for me, bless her. And I spent that month in the shop, learning, reading the repair manuals Klein had kept in neat order on the shelf above the work table, watching YouTube tutorials in the evenings, taking apart a broken mantel clock piece by piece and putting it back together 3 times until it worked. I was not good at it, but I was present. I was paying attention in a way I hadn't paid attention to anything in years. I hired a young woman named Grace who'd studied horology in college and couldn't find work in her field, and I told her I'd learn from her if she'd learn the business side from me. She thought I was eccentric. She was probably right, but she said yes. I hung 2 things on the wall behind the counter. The first was a photograph from the notebook's back pocket, a small, faded photo of Wilhelm Klein as a younger man, standing in front of this very shop the year it opened. He was smiling in it. I hadn't seen him smile in 4 years of Fridays, and it surprised me how much it looked like my own. The second was the silver pocket watch on its leather cord. I had it cleaned and regulated, and it kept perfect time.
Grace said it was probably worth a fair amount of money. I said it wasn't for sale. Sometimes, when it's quiet in the shop and Grace is working on something in the back, I look at that watch and I think about my mother, about the weight she carried, about the decision she made when she was a young woman who'd been told she wasn't good enough, and how that decision rippled forward through decades and landed, finally, in the shape of my life. I forgave her. It took time, I won't pretend otherwise. There were months when I was still angry, when I'd be in the middle of something ordinary and the anger would just rise up hot and sudden. But forgiveness isn't a moment. It's more like a clock that you wind a little every day, and eventually you realize it's just running on its own. She did the best she could with the hurt she had, and she raised me to be someone who shows up, who pays attention, who gives people the benefit of the doubt, even when he's not sure why. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. If you've ever had to forgive someone for keeping a truth that wasn't entirely theirs to keep, this story is for you. Patricia Klein came into the shop in September, about 5 months after the ruling. She came alone on a Tuesday afternoon, and she stood in the doorway for a moment before coming in, like she wanted to make sure she still had the option to leave. I didn't make a fuss. I just said, "Come in," and offered her a seat. She stayed for 2 hours. She told me about Daniel, my father, the kind of man he was. His laugh, which she said was too loud and too sudden, and always made people startled and then charmed. His habit of fixing things around the house that didn't need fixing. The way he'd grieved, quietly, and for years, a loss she hadn't understood until now. She didn't apologize for Richard, but at one point she said, "I should have asked questions sooner. I'm good at not asking questions. My family was very good at that." I said, "So was mine." And we sat with that for a little while, in the way that people do when they're finding the first small patch of common ground. She's come back 4 times since then. We don't have the language of family yet. It's too new, too strange-shaped for that. But we have coffee, and we have conversation, and we have a shared history that we're both still learning how to hold. That's enough. For now, that's exactly enough.
I still drive on Fridays. Not for work. Grace manages the shop on Fridays, and we have enough regular customers now to keep the lights on. I drive because I want to. Because I spent 20 years in that cab making sense of the world through a windshield, and I'm not ready to give that up entirely. But I drive differently now. I take the long way. I go slowly down streets I used to rush through. I roll the window down even when it's cold because I don't want anything between me and the world out there. And sometimes when I pass Carver Street, I look at the shop, at the new sign we hung, simple black letters on a white background, Klein's Timepieces, 1971. And I think about how many Friday evenings I drove an old man 6 blocks and handed him back his $1 tip in my mind and never once asked the question that was right there, waiting. I think about how patience looks from the outside, like indifference. How love looks, sometimes like silence. I think about a man who sat in my back seat for 4 years, learning who I was before he could figure out how to tell me who we were to each other. And I think, what a strange and human thing to be too afraid of the answer to ask the question, to keep circling the truth the way an old clock circles its face, always approaching, always almost arriving, always turning away at the last moment. But the hands get there eventually. That's the thing about clocks. Given enough time, they always get there. There's a boy who comes into the shop on Wednesday afternoons, maybe 11 years old, lives down the block, parents both working late. His name is Marcus, and he's fascinated by the pocket watches. He'll stand at the case for 20 minutes just looking. One Wednesday I said, "You want to know how they work?" His face lit up like I'd offered him something rare. We spent an hour that afternoon taking apart a simple movement, just the basics, just the gears and the mainspring, and putting it back together. He asked more questions than I had answers for, and I told him so, and I handed him one of the manuals from the shelf and said he could borrow it if he wanted. He looked at me very seriously and said, "Are you sure you trust me with it?" I thought about a notebook full of careful handwriting, about a $1 bill on top of exact change,
about a question asked 53 times without a real answer. "I'm sure," I said. "Come back and tell me what you learned." He was back the following Wednesday. He's been back every week since.
Some connections are made in a moment. Some are made in 53 moments, one at a time, until they finally hold. I keep the shop open until 6 on Fridays. After I lock up, I drive. Just a short loop, nothing deliberate, nothing planned. A few miles of familiar roads in the golden evening light. I'm not picking anyone up. I'm not dropping anyone off. I'm just staying connected. To the road, to the town, to the thread of time that runs through every ordinary Friday and makes it, quietly, extraordinary. I used to think I was alone in the world. I know better now. For the first time in my life, I feel free. You've been listening to Every Friday at the Old Clock Shop. A man spent 4 years sitting 6 inches behind the grandfather he didn't know he had. An old man spent 4 years searching for the courage to say, "You are mine, and I am yours, and I'm sorry it took me so long." We spend so much of our lives waiting for the right moment. We keep our truths in lockboxes and our love in notebooks and our questions right at the edge of our tongues, never quite making it out into the air. But consider this. Somewhere near you, right now, there may be a person who has been watching over you in ways you haven't noticed. A quiet fare, a $1 tip, a question asked every week without explanation. Real family is the people who actually want you there. And they don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they just get in the back seat and wait to see if you'll take the long way home. What would you have done?